So as we talked about before the break, the stuff we're going to cover between now and the end of the year is some of the most important stuff for IB Paper 3, History of the Americas, on your Cold War section. It's going to be about some aspect of the Cold War. If it is about the United States, it might be something about American culture or society during the Cold War. It could be about American foreign policy during the Cold War. It might be about Vietnam. It might be about our containment policy. You guys would do pretty well with our containment policy in Europe and our containment policy in Asia. But until today and in our next couple days, we don't have a whole lot of ammunition for our containment policy in Latin America. So for a question like that, this stuff is going to be huge. And then for anything that has you look specifically at what's going on in Latin American countries with regard to their existence during the Cold War, how they are being impacted by the Cold War, or a specific country in Latin America like Cuba, which is the one we are choosing to go in a little bit more depth on, you'll be able to address any question that you'll be asked on Paper 3 about Cuba and the Cold War. Thank you so much. Just drop it off. Cool. I want to remind us about where the United States is with regards to its Latin American relationship in all of the years before the Cold War begins, all right? And here's where we want to go back to the 19th century, back to the early 19th century, and we've got American policy in the 1800s with regard to Latin America being one of what? What do you guys think of when you think of American foreign policy, Latin America, 19th century? What do I hear? Even before that, even before Good Neighbor. This actually comes from the early 20th century, or early 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine, you guys recall this? Very good. Okay, the Monroe Doctrine says, where'd we go? Monroe Doctrine, Western European countries that had colonies in the Americas and had been pushed out of the Americas by revolutionary movements in the early 19th century. The Monroe Doctrine said to those European countries, hey guys, this stuff here, this is our backyard. You steer clear. Don't you come interfering in the Americas. This is our business. You guys can do what you need to do with Europe. You do what you need to do with Africa and Asia. But the Americas is our business. And that was our policy as we pushed through the 19th century. As we got to the end of the 19th century, remember we fought a war against Spain. When we fought the Spanish-American War, we defeated Spain, and we helped Cuba get their independence from Spain. We took some territories in the Caribbean from Spain, like Puerto Rico, we took from Spain, and along with some holdings in Asia that Spain had as well. And now we start to enter into the United States seeing itself as an imperial power. And Teddy Roosevelt is going to enhance that Monroe Doctrine. You guys might recall from last year the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where the United States will interfere or will impose our interests on Latin America. One example that you probably talked about last year was with Panama. Panama was an offshoot of the country of Colombia in South America. So the original Colombia included Panama. We wanted a little part of Panama because we wanted to dig a canal through there. And so we worked with some friends in Panama and supported Panamanian independence. And basically had a deal. If we support Panamanian independence, you guys become an independent nation, we'll help you out, and then we will be able to control this little strip of land where we can dig a canal. Today we call it the Canal Zone. And so we do that with Panama. We talked about Woodrow Wilson last year. Do you guys remember talking about Woodrow Wilson in Latin America and what he called moral diplomacy? That there was a moral imperative that the United States was living life the right way. And that we had a moral imperative to spread that way of life into the Americas, ultimately at America's best interest. We saw that that would be in America's interest to do that, right? And so from the 1930s to before, 1930 and before, the American relationship with Latin America was one of dominance. We were kind of the father figure, the big brother. We at least saw ourselves as such. We were economically more powerful than anybody else in the Americas. We were certainly militarily more powerful than anybody else in the Americas. And we tried to dominate the American region. In the 1930s, that changes. And Ms. Wagner, that's where we get what? Okay, 1930s is the good neighbor policy. Franklin Roosevelt begins to change America's relationship with Latin America. 2 reasons why we are looking for a reset with Latin America in the 1930s. Give me one. Yes, Gab? Okay, you could look at it like that. Why are we low on funds? What's going on in the 30s? Okay, we're in the midst of the Great Depression. And we hadn't been doing a lot of interference with Latin America in the 30s. The United States was seeing itself as a more isolationist nation and really looking inward, especially during the Great Depression. But what could a better relationship with Latin America do? Sure. Okay, so we've got 2 things. Better relations with Latin America, this good neighbor relationship with Latin America, might foster better trade relations with Latin American countries during the Great Depression. So that's good. And as the 1930s progress, as we start to see things get a little hairier in Europe, and start to see things in 1937 and after get a little hairier in Asia, we didn't want any Latin American country to join sides with Germany or Japan, all right? And that's not like out of the realm of possibility. Please remember, during World War I, the Germans tried to get the Mexicans to invade the United States. The British intercepted the Zimmerman telegram that told us about it. So it's not crazy for us to think such a thing. So we want to keep everybody in the Americas neutral. We want to stay neutral. We want them neutral as well. And they stay neutral until December of 1941. Our neutrality will end, right? We are attacked by Japan at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. The next day we declare war. Shortly after, Germany declares war on us. So now we are in World War II. And instead of being a good neighbor arguing for neutrality, the United States now goes on a full court press to try to get Latin American nations in the war, right? We try to convince Brazil to join the war. We try to convince Mexico to join the war effort. And by early 1941, by early 1942, Brazil and later Mexico will join the war effort, right? With a little help from Nazi U-boats that are sinking Brazilian ships. So Brazil joins the war effort, and that's huge, and we've got a great relationship with Brazil during the war. They are sending us a really important resource for an industrial power. What is that? Rubber, very good. Not just for tires, but for hundreds of components inside engines and such. So we're getting rubber out of Brazil. We get natural resources from Mexico. We are able to use Brazil as naval bases that help us out in our Operation Torch to jump into Africa. So these countries then join the war effort. The war comes to an end in 1945. And now the question is, what's our relationship with Latin America going to be in the years going forward? But you already know. Our focus in the world after World War II is not going to be on the Americas. Where's it going to be? Western Europe. Remember, 1947, the Truman Doctrine. Pump in support to Greece and Turkey so they can resist communist uprisings. 1948 is the Marshall Plan. Pump in billions of dollars into Western Europe so they can resist the temptation of growing communist movements. Right? So our focus is primarily on Europe in the early years. That doesn't mean there is no focus in the Americas. In 1945, right before World War II in Europe comes to an end, in March of 1945, the United States and our Latin American friends will sign an agreement, and this is a mouthful, and I'm going to shorten it up with what's on the back of the board there. In March of 1945, please do not write this, do not memorize this, we signed the Inter-American Reciprocal Assistance and Solidarity Agreement. Oh, that mess of a name can be channeled down into the Act of Chapultepec, named after the place where it was signed. The Act of Chapultepec. This was in March of 1945, and it was an agreement between the United States and Latin American allies, which was pretty much all of them, that all of these countries in the Americas were sovereign nations. To be a sovereign nation, you should know that word, S-O-V-E-R-E-I-G-N, like to reign. To be sovereign means you rule yourself. No one else can interfere in your internal affairs. We are a sovereign nation. No one can mess with what we do within our border. So it guaranteed everybody's sovereignty. and diplomatic equality. When we say diplomatic equality, we are talking about everybody, United States and Brazil, United States and Mexico, United States and Venezuela. We are diplomatically equal. No one is more important, no one is more powerful than each other. Now, we're saying that. Do you think we really believe that? Probably not. But it sounds good, right? It sounds good. Diplomatically equal, everybody's sovereign. Great. But as I said, our focus during the 1940s is going to be on Latin America, or going to be on Europe, not Latin America. And through the duration of the rest of the 1940s, from 1946 to 1950, of all the foreign aid that the United States spends, all the money that we send to foreign countries, only 2% of those dollars are going to make it to Latin America. So a very small drop in the bucket is actually going to Latin America. Quick timeout. Foreign aid. Don't need to write this. Foreign aid. These are dollars or other kinds of aid that the United States sends to other nations. If we go back to the 1930s and before, we didn't spend a lot of money in foreign aid. Today, the United States spends billions of dollars in foreign aid. Many Americans have a big problem with this. And this, I think, was a theme of the Trump campaign, that we are spending such tremendous amounts of money overseas when we still have like hungry people in the United States. We have veterans in VA hospitals that aren't doing very well. What is the rationale of America's foreign aid spending? Why do we do this, even when we have issues internally? Why do we spend so much money sending money to Egypt and Israel and Jordan and dozens of other countries around the world? Why do we do this? Jeff?
Military assistance from some of those countries like Israel?
Okay, we do have military alliances and agreements with other nations, and we support them, sure. The ins and the outs of it, I think the reality of the situation is what we learned from the 20th century. In the 1930s, recall that we stayed pretty isolated. We stayed out of European affairs, right? Then World War II comes along, the most costly war that mankind has ever fought, both in terms of life and in fortunes, right? And then the Cold War comes along, and we immediately change course. Within 3 years after the end of the Cold War, we're pumping billions of dollars into Western Europe for Western Europe to rebuild. We are pumping billions of dollars into Japan for Japan to rebuild. And going forward, what happened? The countries that we fought the Second World War with, Japan and West Germany, or Germany, West Germany pretty soon, now they are two of our best allies in the world. Nobody thinks we're ever going to get into another war with Germany. Nobody thinks a war with Japan is anything that could ever happen again. And so the idea of this foreign aid is that a little bit of foreign aid, now, even though billion sounds like a lot, a little bit of foreign aid today is far cheaper than possible conflict down the road. It's this gamble. It's kind of like buying insurance, right? You pay for your insurance in hopes of ultimately never having to pay the bigger costs associated with getting your car crashed, right? You buy insurance now. Think of foreign aid kind of like American insurance to avoid more expensive conflicts down the road. But after World War II, we're spending the majority of our foreign aid on Western Europe, not Latin America. In 1947, the United States and our Latin American friends are going to sign another agreement called the Treaty of Rio, or the Rio Treaty. In this agreement, the United States and its Latin American friends are going to agree that an attack on one nation in the Americas is an attack on all nations of the Americas. This is kind of like a NATO agreement in the Americas. And that way everybody can be secure in the Americas, knowing that no one would threaten us, because then they would deal with everybody. The United States sees this as an anti-communist agreement. Of course, in 1947, our fears about foreign attacks come from the fears of the expansion of communism. So we see this Rio Treaty as an anti-communist agreement. As such, some of our most powerful allies in the Americas, like Brazil, like Chile, and even Cuba, are going to ban communist organizations in their country. Make it illegal to be a communist in those countries. Can't have a communist party in those countries. And those countries will also cut off all relationship, cut off diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union. So this is the United States strengthening our American alliance and trying to freeze the Soviet Union out. And what word could we use now for this trying to freeze the Soviet Union out of the Americas? This is our containment policy in the Americas. Cool? We will send some aid to Latin America. Again, 2% of the aid that we're sending to all foreign nations is going to Latin America from 46 to 50. But most of that aid going into Latin America is military in nature. We are sending arms. We are sending what? After World War II, the United States has a lot of leftover weapons. We were the arsenal of democracy, fighting Germany and Japan at the same time. Now we're done with all that stuff. And we have a lot of it to sell or give. And so most of the aid that's going into Latin America is not about economic development. It's about military aid, which is going to strengthen these governments and their armies. Many in Latin America are going to grow frustrated with that. Does the Brazilian army getting new guns, does that help out a poor Brazilian farmer? Not so much. So we're going to start to see some resentment grow. And this is at the same time, again, that the United States is pumping billions of dollars into Western Europe for the Marshall Plan, where they're building roads, and they're building sewer systems, and they're building electrical grids. They're putting Europe back together. And South America is not going to get that same kind of aid. In 1948, the United States and our Latin American friends, and we're going to soon bring Canada into the mix, will form what is called the Organization of American States. The Organization of American States. Again, this sounds really good. It is a commitment between all of these nations in the organization. It is a commitment of non-intervention. Nobody's going to get involved in anybody else's internal business. And it makes a call to support ideas like human rights and democracy and economic cooperation between these nations. But according to the United States and many of our friends in Latin American countries, being communist is the opposite of being free. Communism is incompatible with freedom. So while the Organization of American States talks about staying out of other countries' internal affairs, the United States certainly does not want to see any of these countries move towards communism, because we see that as challenging the freedom of the people of those countries. We're going to end there, but I want you to get one last phrase into your notes for today. All of this stuff we're talking about, from the 19th century Monroe Doctrine to the early 20th century Roosevelt Corollary and moral diplomacy, to the good neighbor policy of the 1930s, to now this post-World War II Organization of American States, Chapultepec Act, all this stuff. This is what we call hemispheric relations, or I should say, this is what the IB is going to term as hemispheric relations. Sometimes my students have gotten freaked out in the past when an IB question is going to talk about hemispheric relations and how they fare because of World War II or during the early Cold War. All they're talking about is the relationship between the United States and other countries in the Americas. All right? By the time we get to 1950, we're looking pretty good. We're looking pretty good. Got a decent relationship after World War II. We are giving some aid to Latin American nations, although it's mostly military, not much economic development. But largely, we have a positive relationship with the nations of Latin America. The 1950s will start to change much of that, and we'll talk about that next week.